The morning sun painted golden streaks across the stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Cathedral in the heart of Boston. Sophie Martin stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal preparation room, her hands trembling as she adjusted the delicate lace veil that cascaded down her back. The ivory wedding gown hugged her figure perfectly, exactly as she had imagined during the countless fittings over the past year, at 29 years old. Sophie had waited patiently for this moment. She worked as an elementary school teacher at Riverside Academy, where her third-grade students adored her gentle nature and creative teaching methods. Her life had been simple but fulfilling, and when Daniel Bennett proposed to her 2 years ago, on a snowy December evening, she believed she had found her perfect future. Daniel was 27, 2 years younger than Sophie, and worked as an accountant at a modest financial firm downtown. He was careful with money, methodical in his planning, and always seemed to have a spreadsheet for every aspect of their lives together. Sophie found his organized nature comforting, steady anchor in the unpredictable currents of life. Her mother, Patricia Martin, entered the preparation room with tears already forming in her eyes. She wore a powder blue dress that matched the bridesmaid gowns, and her silver hair was styled in soft curls. Patricia had raised Sophie alone after her father passed away when Sophie was just 12 years old. Working double shifts as a nurse to provide for her daughter's education and dreams. "You look absolutely beautiful, sweetheart," Patricia whispered, reaching out to smooth an imaginary wrinkle from Sophie's dress. "Your father would have been so proud to walk you down the aisle today." Sophie smiled, though her heart ached at the mention of her father. Instead, her Uncle Robert would escort her down the aisle, a kind man who had stepped in to help their family whenever they needed support. The cathedral was filled with nearly 200 guests, including her fellow teachers from Riverside Academy, her childhood friends from the neighborhood, and the entire Bennett family who had welcomed her warmly over the past 2 years. The wedding coordinator, a brisk woman named Helen with a clipboard permanently attached to her hand, poked her head through the doorway. 10 minutes, Miss Martin? The groom should be taking his position at the altar now." Sophie took a deep breath, her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath clutched tightly in her hands. This was really happening. In just a few minutes, she would walk down that aisle and become Mrs. Daniel Bennett. They had already signed the lease on a cozy apartment in Cambridge, picked out furniture together, and planned a modest honeymoon to Cape Cod. Everything was falling into place exactly as they had organized it. The traditional wedding march began to play, the organ's rich tones filling the cathedral. Sophie linked her arm through Uncle Robert's, who patted her hand reassuringly. The heavy wooden doors opened, and she stepped into the main aisle, her eyes immediately searching for Daniel at the altar. But the space where her groom should have been standing was empty. Father Thomas, an elderly priest who had known the Bennett family for decades, stood at the altar with his hands clasped in front of him, his expression troubled. Next to him, Daniel's best man shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the side door of the cathedral. The bridesmaids, Sophie's 3 closest friends from college, stood in their positions looking confused and worried. Sophie's steps faltered. Uncle Robert tightened his grip on her arm, providing silent support as whispers began to ripple through the congregation. 200 faces turned toward her, some with pity, others with shock, all watching as she continued her slow walk toward an altar without a groom. She felt her face burning with embarrassment, her carefully applied makeup suddenly feeling heavy and false. Where was Daniel? Had something happened to him? An accident? An emergency? Her mind raced through possibilities, each one failing to explain why he wouldn't have sent word, why his best man would be standing there looking guilty rather than concerned. When Sophie reached the altar, Father Thomas stepped forward, his weathered face creased with sympathy. "My dear child," he said softly, "Daniel called about 20 minutes ago." The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. Called, not rushed to the hospital. Not dealing with a family emergency. Called, what did he say? Sophie managed to ask, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Father Thomas hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He said he needs more time, that he's not ready for this commitment. The cathedral seemed to tilt around Sophie. Her bouquet slipped from her numb fingers, white roses scattering across the polished marble floor. Uncle Robert caught her elbow, steadying her as her knees threatened to give way. The whispers grew louder, 200 voices creating a sound like rushing water in her ears. "He left me," Sophie said, and though she spoke quietly, her words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "He actually left me standing here." It was when Christopher Bennett stepped forward from the front pew. At 31 years old, Christopher was 4 years older than his brother Daniel, and in every way his opposite. Where Daniel was cautious and calculating, Christopher was confident and decisive. While Daniel worked in a small accounting office, Christopher had built a successful real estate development company that had transformed several neighborhoods throughout Boston. He was taller than Daniel, broader in the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and green eyes that seemed to see through pretense and politeness. To the truth beneath, Sophie had met Christopher dozens of times over the past 2 years at family gatherings, holiday dinners, and casual Sunday brunches at the Bennett family home. He had always been polite but distant, usually arriving late and leaving early, his phone constantly buzzing with business calls and urgent messages. She knew he was successful, driven, and apparently had little time for romance or relationships. Daniel had once mentioned that Christopher had dated occasionally, but never seriously, always putting his business ventures first. Now Christopher walked up the steps to the altar, his charcoal gray suit perfectly tailored, his expression determined. The congregation watched in stunned silence as he approached Sophie, who stood frozen in her wedding gown, her veil still in place, her mascara beginning to run from tears she hadn't even realized she was shedding. "Sophie," Christopher said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. He didn't lower his gaze from hers, didn't show embarrassment or uncertainty. "My brother's a fool." Sophie blinked, confused by this statement, by his presence, by everything happening around her. "Christopher, I don't understand." What Christopher did next would become the talk of Boston society for months to come. He dropped to one knee right there on the altar steps, in front of 200 shocked guests, in front of his elderly parents in the front pew, in front of Father Thomas, who took an involuntary step backward. "Sophie Martin," Christopher said clearly, "my brother abandoned you. Then marry me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds that had been chirping outside the stained glass windows seemed to hold their breath. Sophie stared down at this man kneeling before her, this near stranger who shared a last name with the man who had just shattered her heart. "What are you doing?" Sophie finally managed to ask, her voice shaking. "I'm offering you a choice," Christopher replied. "You can walk out of this cathedral alone, face all these people, explain to everyone that your groom didn't show up. Or you can marry me instead. Right now. Right here." Patricia Martin had risen from her seat in the front pew, one hand pressed to her chest. "Christopher Bennett, have you lost your mind?" Christopher didn't look away from Sophie. "Maybe, or maybe I'm the only one thinking clearly right now." He paused, then added, "Sophie, you deserve to have your wedding day. You deserve to be married today, just like you planned. And you deserve someone who actually shows up." Now Sophie felt as if she were watching this scene happen to someone else. This couldn't be real. Men didn't propose to their brothers' abandoned brides in the middle of a cathedral. This was insane, impulsive, completely irrational. But as she looked around at the 200 faces staring at her with pity, as she thought about walking back down that aisle alone in her wedding dress, as she imagined the questions and the sympathy and the humiliation that awaited her, something inside Sophie shifted. "Why would you do this?" she asked Christopher. "We barely know each other." Christopher stood up, bringing himself to his full height in front of her. "Because Daniel doesn't deserve you. Because I'm tired of watching good things happen to people who don't appreciate them. And because," he hesitated for just a moment, "maybe it's time I took a chance on something besides a business deal." Father Thomas cleared his throat. "This is highly unusual." "Everything about today is unusual, Father," Christopher replied. He turned back to Sophie. "What do you say? Will you marry me instead?" Sophie closed her eyes. She thought about the apartment she and Daniel had rented, now meaningless. She thought about the carefully planned honeymoon, the joint bank account they had opened, the future she had imagined. All of it had disappeared the moment Daniel made that phone call. But she also thought about her students at Riverside Academy who would ask about her wedding on Monday. She thought about her mother, who had saved for 2 years to help pay for the ceremony. She thought about her own pride, her own dignity, her own stubborn refusal to let Daniel Bennett's cowardice define this day. When Sophie opened her eyes, her decision was made. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, Christopher Bennett, I'll marry you." The cathedral erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. Patricia sank back into her pew, fanning herself with the wedding program. Uncle Robert released Sophie's arm, stepping back with wide eyes. The bridesmaids clutched each other, whispering frantically, but Christopher simply smiled, reached down to collect Sophie's scattered bouquet from the floor, and handed it back to her. "Father Thomas," Christopher said, "I believe we have a wedding to perform." The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike anything Sophie had ever imagined. Father Thomas, after a long moment of hesitation and a glance toward the Bennett family matriarch, who gave a small nod, agreed to proceed. The legal documents were already in place, he explained, and technically only the groom's name had changed. Still, he insisted on a brief pause to ensure both parties understood the gravity of what they were doing. Sophie stood at the altar next to Christopher, acutely aware of how little she actually knew about this man who was about to become her husband. She knew he owned Bennett Development Corporation. She knew he drove a black Mercedes and lived somewhere in the expensive Beacon Hill neighborhood. She knew he took his coffee black and preferred whiskey to wine at family dinners. But beyond these surface details, Christopher Bennett was essentially a stranger. "Sophie Martin," Father Thomas began, his voice solemn. "Do you take Christopher Bennett to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Sophie looked into Christopher's green eyes. They were steady, calm, without a trace of doubt or hesitation. Whatever had motivated him to make this extraordinary gesture, he wasn't wavering now. "I do," Sophie said. "Christopher Bennett, do you take Sophie Martin to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Christopher replied without hesitation. The rings were the same ones Sophie had chosen with Daniel months ago. When Christopher slid the wedding band onto her finger, Sophie felt a strange sensation, as if she were stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness. Not sure if she would fall or fly? "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Father Thomas declared. "You may kiss the bride." Christopher leaned down slowly, giving Sophie every opportunity to turn away if she wanted. She didn't. Their kiss was brief, respectful, but there was something electric in that moment, a spark of possibility that surprised them both. The reception at the Four Seasons Hotel was surreal. The ballroom was decorated exactly as Sophie had planned, with cascading white flowers, soft golden lighting, and elegant table settings. But instead of celebrating with Daniel, she sat at the head table beside Christopher. Trying to process the whirlwind of the past hour, guests approached them cautiously, offering confused congratulations and curious stares. Sophie's fellow teachers from Riverside Academy whispered among themselves, clearly uncertain about what they had just witnessed. Her best friend Jennifer, who had been a bridesmaid, pulled Sophie aside during the cocktail hour. "Sophie, are you sure about this?" Jennifer asked, gripping both of Sophie's hands. "I mean, this is crazy. You just married a man you barely know." "I know it's crazy," Sophie admitted. "But Jennifer, I couldn't walk out of that cathedral alone. I just couldn't. But marriage, that's not just saving face. That's your entire life." Sophie glanced across the ballroom to where Christopher stood talking with his business partner, a tall man named Gregory who seemed equally shocked by the day's events. Maybe sometimes life requires crazy decisions. The first dance was awkward. The DJ played the song Sophie had chosen with Daniel, a romantic ballad that now felt painfully inappropriate. Christopher held her carefully, maintaining a respectful distance as they moved across the dance floor. "I'm sorry about the song," Sophie murmured. I didn't think to change it. It's fine, Christopher replied. Today's your day, Sophie. It should have everything you wanted, even if the groom changed. Why did you really do this? Sophie asked, keeping her voice low so only he could hear. And please don't give me another line about me deserving better. What's the real reason? Christopher was quiet for a moment, guiding her through a gentle turn. Can we talk about that later? When we're alone? Sophie nodded, though curiosity burned inside her. The reception continued with all the traditional elements, the cake cutting, the bouquet toss, the speeches from family and friends that had to be hastily adjusted to acknowledge the unexpected change of groom. Christopher's father, William Bennett, gave a speech that was diplomatic and carefully worded, welcoming Sophie to the family while notably avoiding any mention of his younger son as the evening wore on. And the champagne flowed, the atmosphere relaxed. Guests began to treat the situation as an adventurous, romantic story rather than a scandal. By the time the reception ended at midnight, people were calling it the most memorable wedding they had ever attended. Christopher drove them to his home in Beacon Hill in his Mercedes. The car smelled of leather and the faint scent of his cologne. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, still wearing her wedding gown, feeling like an actress playing a role in someone else's life. The house was at a brownstone on a quiet street lined with gas lamps and old trees. Inside, it was elegantly furnished with modern pieces mixed with antique accents. Hardwood floors gleamed under soft lighting. Large windows overlooked a private garden in the back. It was clearly the home of someone with both money and taste. The guest room is upstairs, second door on the right, Christopher said, carrying in Sophie's overnight bag from the car. You can stay there as long as you want. There's no pressure for this to be anything more than what you're comfortable with. Sophie appreciated his consideration, but it also highlighted the strangeness of their situation. They were married, legally bound, but essentially strangers sharing a house. Thank you, Sophie said, for everything today. For saving me from humiliation, for being kind. Christopher set down her bag and turned to face her. Sophie, I need you to understand something. I didn't do this out of pity or to be a hero. I had my own reasons. What reasons? Get some rest tonight, Christopher said, avoiding the question. We can talk tomorrow, when you've had time to process everything. I imagine today was overwhelming. Over the following week, Sophie began to settle into an unexpected routine. She continued teaching at Riverside Academy, where her students were fascinated by her sudden wedding story, though she kept the details vague. Christopher went to his office every morning at 7 and usually returned around 6 in the evening. They ate dinner together most nights, simple meals that Sophie prepared using ingredients from Christopher's well-stocked kitchen. Living with Christopher was surprisingly easy. He was neat, respectful of her space, and they fell into comfortable conversations about their days. Sophie learned that he had started his development company at 23 with money borrowed from his grandfather. He had taken huge risks, worked 18-hour days, and gradually built an empire. His success had come at the cost of personal relationships, he admitted. He had no time for dating, no energy for romance. Until now, Sophie pointed out one evening as they washed dishes together. Till now, Christopher agreed quietly, on the 8th day of their marriage. Sophie came home early from school. A teacher's meeting had been canceled, giving her an unexpected free afternoon. She entered the quiet house and heard music coming from somewhere upstairs. Following the sound, she discovered a room she hadn't noticed before. A door at the end of the hallway that she had assumed was a closet. The door was slightly ajar. Sophie pushed it open and stepped into a spacious studio filled with natural light from skylights in the ceiling. The walls were covered with paintings, landscapes of New England coastlines, cityscapes of Boston at different times of day, portraits of people Sophie didn't recognize. In the center of the room stood an easel with a large canvas, and the floor was spattered with dried paint in a rainbow of colors Christopher painted. This successful, business-focused man was also an artist. Sophie walked slowly through the studio, examining each piece. They were good, genuinely talented work, with a distinctive style that captured emotion as much as image. She was so absorbed in looking at the paintings that she didn't hear Christopher enter behind her. "I didn't mean for you to find this," he said. Sophie spun around, startled. Christopher stood in the doorway, still wearing his business suit, his tie loosened and his expression unreadable. "Christopher, these are beautiful," Sophie said. "Why didn't you tell me you paint?" "It's not something I share." He walked into the studio and stood beside her. "In my world, art is seen as frivolous. Men like me are supposed to build things, make money, close deals. Painting is a hobby at best, a weakness at worst." "That's ridiculous. This is a gift." Christopher smiled slightly. "Thank you. But it's easier to keep it private." Sophie continued exploring the studio, moving from painting to painting. Then she reached the back corner and stopped breathing. There, on a large canvas, was a portrait of her. She was sitting in a garden, reading a book. Sunlight filtered through leaves overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow across her face and shoulders. She looked peaceful, content, lost in whatever story held her attention. The painting captured not just her physical appearance, but something deeper, a quality of quiet joy and gentle strength. Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Christopher came to stand beside her, looking at the portrait he had created. "Last summer, it was a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. You and Daniel were there for a family barbecue. You disappeared into the garden with a book, and I watched you from the kitchen window for almost an hour." Sophie turned to look at him. "You watched me for an hour?" "I couldn't help it. The way the light hit you, the expression on your face, it was perfect. I took a photo with my phone and started painting it the next day. I've been working on it ever since." "Christopher, that was 8 months ago." "You've been painting me for 8 months." He nodded slowly. "Sophie, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you before we got married, but I was afraid you'd refuse if you knew." Sophie's heart began to beat faster. "What is it?" "I've been in love with you since the day Daniel first brought you home to meet the family," Christopher said. The words came out quietly, but firmly, like a confession he had been holding inside for too long. "It was 2 years ago, a rainy October afternoon. You walked into my parents' house wearing a yellow raincoat, and you were laughing about something Daniel had said. You shook my hand, looked me right in the eyes and smiled, and I knew right then that Daniel had found someone extraordinary, someone he didn't deserve." Sophie felt dizzy. She sat down on the stool near the easel, trying to process this revelation. "For 2 years I watched you with my brother," Christopher continued. "I watched him take you for granted, watched him treat your relationship like another item on his endless to-do list. I watched you try so hard to make him happy, to fit into the life he had planned. And every Sunday dinner, every holiday gathering, every accidental meeting, I fell more in love with you while knowing I could never tell you. Why didn't you say something?" Sophie asked. "Because you were my brother's girlfriend. Because it wasn't my place. Because I thought maybe I was wrong, maybe Daniel would rise to the occasion and become the man you deserved." Christopher ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. "But when he called me on your wedding day, when he told me he was too scared to show up, something inside me snapped. I realized I had been a coward too, just in a different way. I had let 2 years pass without fighting for what I wanted. I wasn't going to let that moment pass too." Sophie looked at the portrait again, seeing it with new understanding. This wasn't just a painting. It was a love letter created in brush strokes and color. "You married me because you loved me," Sophie said slowly. "Yes. But I married you because I was embarrassed and desperate." Christopher flinched slightly at her blunt words, but nodded. "I know, and I'm prepared to live with that. I'm prepared to be patient while you figure out your own feelings. I'm prepared to give you space, time, whatever you need." Sophie stood up and walked back to the portrait. She studied the woman Christopher had painted with such care and attention. That Sophie looked happy, peaceful, genuinely content. When was the last time she had actually felt that way with Daniel? When had she last felt seen, truly seen, by the man she was planning to marry? "Sophie, I need to ask you something," Christopher said. "Yesterday, when you came home from school and told me about your student who was struggling with reading, do you remember what I said?" Sophie thought back. You said we could hire a tutor, or I could work with her after school using specialized techniques. You offered to research reading programs and even suggested we could create a small learning center if there were other students with similar needs. And when Daniel used to tell me about your teaching, do you know what he would say? Christopher asked. He would complain that you worked too many hours, that you brought too much work home, that you cared too much about students who weren't your responsibility. The truth of that observation hit Sophie hard. Daniel had never understood her passion for teaching. He saw it as a job, a means to an income, not a calling or a purpose. Christopher, Sophie said, turning to face him fully. I need to be honest with you about something too, okay? When Father Thomas asked if I would marry you, I said yes because I couldn't bear the humiliation of walking out alone. But during this past week, living here with you, I felt more comfortable and more myself than I ever felt during 2 years with Daniel. And that scares me because I don't know what it means. Christopher took a step closer. What do you want it to mean? Sophie thought about the question. She thought about their easy conversations over dinner. She thought about how Christopher asked about her day and actually listened to the answers. She thought about coming home to this house and feeling welcomed rather than judged. She thought about standing in this studio, surrounded by evidence of Christopher's hidden depths, and realizing how little she had actually known about the man she had almost married, I think. Sophie said carefully, I want to find out if what you feel for me is something I could feel for you. Christopher's expression softened. We have all the time in the world for you to figure that out. Do we, though? We're married, Christopher. That's not exactly a casual dating situation. And we'll date anyway. We'll go out to dinner, go to museums, take walks, talk for hours. We'll get to know each other the way couples should before they make a lifelong commitment. We just happen to be doing it in reverse order. Sophie laughed, surprising herself. That's completely backwards. Most of my best business deals started backwards, too. Sometimes the unconventional approach is the right one. That night, Sophie didn't sleep in the guest room. She and Christopher stayed up until 3 in the morning in the studio, talking about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, their favorite books and movies and foods. They shared stories and secrets, building in hours the foundation that most couples build over months of dating. When Sophie finally went to bed in the guest room, she felt different. The grief and humiliation of Daniel's abandonment had begun to transform into something else, gratitude. Gratitude that she had been saved from a marriage that would have slowly suffocated her. Gratitude that fate, or luck, or divine intervention had placed Christopher in that cathedral at exactly the right moment, and something more than gratitude. Something she wasn't quite ready to name yet. But that felt like the first green shoots of spring after a long winter, 3 months after their unconventional wedding. Sophie had fully moved into the master bedroom with Christopher. It had been a gradual transition, starting with falling asleep on the couch together during a movie night. Then Christopher carrying her to his bed rather than waking her. The next morning, waking up beside him, had felt natural rather than awkward. And Sophie realized she didn't want to go back to sleeping alone. Their relationship deepened with each passing day. Christopher would leave small gifts for Sophie to find. A first edition of her favorite novel. Art supplies when she mentioned wanting to try painting. A donation made in her name to the literacy program she supported. Sophie cooked meals that reminded Christopher of his grandmother's recipes. Left encouraging notes in his briefcase before important meetings. And slowly filled the house with warmth and laughter it had never known. One Saturday morning in June, Sophie woke to find Christopher already gone from bed. Following the smell of coffee, she found him in the kitchen making breakfast. Something he had started doing on weekends as his contribution to their domestic partnership. Good morning, he said, kissing her softly. These kisses had become frequent, natural expressions of affection that no longer felt strange or obligatory. I have something to show you after breakfast. What is it? Sophie asked, curious. You'll see. After they ate, Christopher led Sophie to his car and drove them across the city to a neighborhood Sophie didn't recognize. He pulled up in front of a vacant building, a beautiful old structure with good bones, but obvious signs of neglect. What is this? Sophie asked. Christopher handed her a folder of architectural plans. This could be your school, Sophie opened the folder and saw detailed drawings for renovating the building into an educational facility, specifically designed for children with learning differences. There were classrooms with specialized lighting, quiet sensory rooms, outdoor learning spaces, and technology centers. Christopher, I don't understand. You told me your dream was to open a school for kids who struggle in traditional classrooms, Christopher said. Kids with dyslexia, attention difficulties, autism. Kids who are brilliant but need different teaching approaches. You said you wanted to create a place where every child could learn at their own pace without feeling broken or wrong. Sophie remembered that conversation. It had been late at night, one of their long talks where she shared the dreams she had never told anyone, not even Daniel. Dreams that seemed too big, too expensive, too impossible. This building is perfect for that vision, Christopher continued. I bought it last month. My company can do the renovation at cost, and I can provide the initial operating capital. But Sophie, this would be your project, your school, your name on the door. I'm just the investor who believes in what you can accomplish. Tears filled Sophie's eyes. This is too much. I can't accept this. Why not? Because it's your money, your resources. It's too generous. Christopher took her hands. Sophie, what's mine is yours. We're married, remember? And more than that, I believe in you. I believe you could change lives with this school. Let me help you make it happen. Sophie looked at the building, imagining the children who could learn there, thrive there, discover their own brilliance in an environment designed for their success. It was everything she had dreamed of, but never believed possible. Okay, she whispered. Let's do it. Over the next few months, Sophie threw herself into planning the school. She researched curriculum, interviewed potential teachers, designed learning programs, and worked with Christopher's architects to perfect every detail of the building renovation. Christopher supported her every step, offering business advice while never trying to control her vision. In September, for months after discovering the building, Sophie received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed Daniel's number. She hadn't heard from him since the wedding day, and seeing his name on her screen made her stomach clench with anxiety. Hello? Sophie answered cautiously. Sophie, it's Daniel. His voice sounded strained. I need to see you. Can we meet? First instinct was to refuse to protect the new life she had built, but part of her needed closure, needed to understand why he had done what he did. Okay, she said. Where? They agreed to meet at a coffee shop near Boston Common, a neutral public place. Sophie told Christopher about the meeting, and though she could see the worry in his eyes, he didn't try to stop her. Do you want me to come with you? Christopher offered. No, this is something I need to do alone, but thank you. Daniel was already at the coffee shop when Sophie arrived, sitting at a corner table looking thin and tired. He stood when he saw her, his expression a mixture of regret and hope. Sophie, thank you for meeting me, Daniel said. You look wonderful. What do you want, Daniel? Sophie asked, sitting down across from him. She noticed she felt nothing looking at him now. No anger, no longing, no unresolved feelings. Just a vague sense of pity for this man who seemed so lost. I made the biggest mistake of my life, Daniel said. Leaving you at that altar, watching you marry Christopher, it's haunted me every day since. Sophie, I was scared. The idea of marriage, of forever, it paralyzed me. But I've been seeing a therapist, working through my commitment issues, and I realize now that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. Sophie listened quietly, letting him finish. I want another chance, Daniel continued. I know it sounds crazy. I know you're married to Christopher now, but that marriage was done out of desperation. It wasn't real. You didn't choose him. You chose to avoid humiliation. We can fix this. We can get that marriage annulled and start over. I'm ready now, Sophie. I'm ready to be the husband you deserve. Sophie looked at this man who thought he could undo months of her life with an apology and a therapy revelation. She thought about how to respond, how to make him understand what he had lost, not through abandoning her, but through never truly seeing her in the first place. Daniel, can I ask you something? Sophie said. What's my biggest dream? Daniel blinked, confused by the question. To get married and have a family? No, that was your assumption, but that's not my dream. Try again. To be a good teacher. Sophie shook her head. You don't know, do you? In 2 years together, You never once asked me about my deepest dreams. You never asked what I wanted to accomplish with my life beyond being your wife. Sophie, my dream is to open a school for children with learning differences, Sophie said. To create a place where kids who struggle in traditional classrooms can thrive, to prove that intelligence comes in many forms and every child deserves an education that honors their unique way of learning. I told you about this dream once, early in our relationship. Do you remember what you said? Daniel's face showed he didn't remember. You said it sounded nice, but impractical. That I needed to focus on realistic goals. I should be happy with my teaching job and not reach for things beyond our means. Sophie paused. Christopher heard that dream and bought me a building. He's helping me turn that impossible dream into reality. That's the difference between you and him. It can change, Daniel insisted. I can support your dreams now. Daniel, I don't love you anymore, Sophie said gently. Maybe I never really did. I loved the idea of you, the stability you represented, the future that seemed safe and planned. But that's not love, not real love. Real love is what I have with Christopher. You've only known him for a few months. In those months, he's seen me more clearly than you did in 2 years. He knows my favorite book is To Kill a Mockingbird because I read it every summer. He knows I'm afraid of driving at night because my father died in a car accident. He knows I cry during sad movies even when the endings are happy. He knows me, Daniel. All of me. Daniel slumped in his chair. So that's it? You're just going to stay married to my brother? I'm going to stay married to the man I love, Sophie corrected. The man who loves me back completely and unconditionally. She stood up to leave, but Daniel reached out and grabbed her wrist. Sophie, please. Just think about it. We had something real. Don't throw that away. Sophie gently removed her wrist from his grasp. We had something comfortable. There's a difference. I hope you find what you're looking for, Daniel. I really do. But you won't find it with me. She walked out of the coffee shop feeling lighter than she had in years. That chapter of her life was finally closed. She was ready to fully embrace the unexpected story she was now writing. When Sophie arrived home, Christopher was in the studio painting. He looked up as she entered, searching her face for clues about how the meeting had gone. He wanted me back, Sophie said. Christopher's jaw tightened. And I told him I'm in love with my husband. The paintbrush in Christopher's hand clattered to the floor. What did you say? Sophie walked across the studio and stood in front of him. I said I'm in love with my husband. With you, Christopher, I love you. Not because you rescued me, not because you're generous or successful, or because you bought me a building, though all of those things are wonderful. I love you because you see me, because you make me laugh, because you support my dreams without trying to control them, because coming home to you every day feels like the best part of my day. Christopher pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I love you so much, he whispered against her hair. I have loved you for so long. They stood like that for a long time, surrounded by paintings. Held by the certainty that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most extraordinary destinations. 2 weeks later, Christopher surprised Sophie with a weekend trip to a coastal town in Maine. They checked into a charming bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean. And on Saturday evening, Christopher led Sophie down to a private beach as the sun began to set. A small gathering of people waited there. Sophie's mother, Patricia. Christopher's parents, Sophie's best friend Jennifer, and Father Thomas from St. Catherine's Cathedral. Christopher, what is this? Sophie asked. Christopher took both her hands. Our first wedding was about saving you from humiliation. It was impulsive and desperate and unconventional. But Sophie, I want to marry you again. I want to marry you for the right reasons this time. Because we choose each other. Because we love each other. Because we can't imagine our lives any other way. He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a ring. Not a traditional engagement ring, but something unique. A band of white gold with tiny sapphires that matched Sophie's eyes. Sophie Martin Bennett, Christopher said, dropping to one knee in the sand. Will you marry me again? Will you stand with me in front of our families and make vows that we right ourselves? Will you commit to building a life together, not out of obligation, but out of love? Sophie was crying, happy tears that blurred the sunset into streaks of orange and gold. Yes, she said. Yes, absolutely yes. The ceremony that followed was simple and perfect. They stood barefoot in the sand as the waves rolled in behind them. Father Thomas officiated again, smiling at the dramatic difference between this ceremony and the chaotic one 4 months earlier. Sophie and Christopher had written their own vows. Christopher went first. "Sophie, when I married you the first time, I made a promise to be patient while you figured out your feelings. Today, I make a different promise. I promise to love you actively, openly, without reservation. I promise to support your dreams even when they seem impossible. I promise to see you, really see you, every day for the rest of our lives. I promise that our life together will be built on honesty, respect, and the kind of love that grows stronger with time." Sophie smiled through her tears. "Christopher, when you proposed to me in that cathedral, you saved me from the worst day of my life. But you've done so much more than that. You've shown me what it means to be truly loved. You've supported my wildest dreams. You've been patient while I figured out what my heart was trying to tell me. Today, I promise to love you with that same generosity and devotion. I promise to build a life with you that honors both our dreams. I promise to choose you every day, not because I have to, but because I want to. Because you are my best friend, my partner, and the great love of my life." When Father Thomas pronounced them husband and wife this time, their kiss was long and deep, full of promise and passion and certainty. Their small audience cheered, and Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. After the ceremony, they had a dinner on the beach, fresh seafood, champagne, and a small cake decorated with waves and seashells. As the stars came out overhead, Christopher and Sophie walked along the water's edge, hand in hand. "Do you think people will ever stop talking about how we got married?" Sophie asked. "Probably not," Christopher admitted. "We'll be the couple who met at someone else's wedding for the rest of our lives." "I can live with that," Sophie said, smiling. 1 year later, Sophie's school opened its doors. The Beacon Learning Center welcomed 30 students in its first semester, children ages 6 to 12 who had struggled in traditional educational settings. Sophie hired a team of specialized teachers who shared her vision. And Christopher's company had transformed the old building into a bright, welcoming space designed for diverse learning styles. The opening day was chaotic and wonderful. Parents cried with relief at finding a school that understood their children's needs. Students explored classrooms designed specifically for them. Teachers buzzed with excitement about implementing innovative curriculum. Christopher stood in the doorway watching Sophie in her element, moving from child to child, learning names, offering encouragement, radiating pure joy. She looked up and caught his eye, smiling that smile that still made his heart skip a beat. That evening, as they sat in their garden at home, exhausted but happy, Sophie made an announcement. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. Christopher froze, his wine glass halfway to his lips. "What? I'm pregnant." "About 8 weeks along. I saw the doctor yesterday to confirm." Christopher set down his glass and pulled Sophie into his arms, holding her close. "We're having a baby. We're having a baby," Sophie confirmed, laughing at his stunned expression. "I need to build a nursery, and we need to baby-proof the house. And I should research pediatricians." And Sophie pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping his stream of consciousness planning. "Christopher, we have time. 7 months to be exact." He kissed her fingers, then her hand, then pulled her close again. "I love you so much. I love you too." As they sat together in the garden, surrounded by the life they had built together, Sophie thought about that terrifying morning in St. Catherine's Cathedral. She thought about standing at the altar, abandoned and humiliated, certain her life was over. She never could have imagined then that her greatest heartbreak would lead to her greatest joy. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are really just the universe pushing us toward where we're meant to be. Sometimes the most unexpected paths lead home. And sometimes, when one door closes, another one opens with a man kneeling on the altar steps, offering not just rescue, but real love. Sophie Martin had gone to that cathedral to marry a man she thought she knew. She left married to a stranger. But that stranger became her best friend, her partner, her true love. The man who saw her completely and loved every part of what he saw. Daniel's abandonment had seemed like an ending. Instead, it was the beginning of everything Sophie never knew she wanted. a love deeper than she imagined possible, a dream career that fulfilled her purpose, a family built on genuine connection rather than convenience. As Christopher placed his hand on Sophie's still flat stomach, feeling for the life growing there, he remembered that day in the cathedral. He remembered the wild impulse that made him kneel before his brother's abandoned bride. At the time, he thought he was taking the biggest risk of his life. He had no idea he was making the best decision he would ever make. Their daughter was born the following spring. A healthy baby girl they named Grace, for the unexpected grace that had brought them together. Grace grew up hearing the story of how her parents got married twice, first out of necessity, and then out of love. She would ask to hear the story again and again, never tiring of the tale of the brave mommy who said yes when everything seemed lost, and the daddy who loved her enough to take a chance. The Beacon Learning Center expanded over the years, eventually serving over 200 students across 3 locations. Sophie became known as an innovator in special education, speaking at conferences and training other teachers. But she never stopped teaching, never stopped working directly with the kids who needed her most. Christopher's business continued to thrive, but he made sure to balance work with family time. Every Sunday, the Bennett family gathered together, including Daniel, who eventually married a kind woman who suited him much better than Sophie ever had. The brothers had reconciled, their relationship strengthened by honesty and forgiveness. On their 10th anniversary, Christopher and Sophie returned to that beach in Maine. They renewed their vows again, this time with Grace and her younger brother Thomas watching. As they stood in the same spot where they had married for the 2nd time, Sophie reflected on the decade they had built together. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Christopher that night as they walked along the moonlit beach. The impulse that started all this? Christopher pulled her close. "Regret marrying you? Never. It was the best decision I ever made. Even though it was completely crazy, especially because it was completely crazy. Sometimes the best things in life require a leap of faith." Sophie thought about that 16-year-old girl who had dreamed of being a teacher, the 27-year-old woman who had settled for safe and comfortable, and the 29-year-old bride who had stood abandoned at the altar. She thought about how each version of herself had led to this moment, standing on a beach with the man she loved, having built a life beyond her wildest dreams. "Thank you," Sophie said softly. "For what? For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For loving me before I knew how to be loved. For taking that crazy chance in the cathedral." Christopher kissed her forehead. "Thank you for saying yes." Both times, they stood together watching the waves roll in, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely way, who had built a love strong enough to weather any storm. Their story had started with a scandal and a desperate proposal, but it had become something beautiful, something lasting, something real, and they lived happily. Not in the perfect, uncomplicated way of fairy tales, but in the messy, wonderful, authentic way of 2 people who chose each other every single day. 2 people who proved that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the most unexpected proposals. "My brother abandoned you? Then marry me." Those words, shouted in a moment of impulse and desperation, had changed everything. They had rescued Sophie from humiliation and led her to a love she never knew existed. They had given Christopher the courage to fight for what he wanted, instead of watching life pass by. They had created a family, a legacy, and a love story that would be told for generations. And it all started with saying yes to the impossible.